All right, guys, welcome back to the Adventist History Podcast. You're watching Season 2. This is Episode 29, The Color Line, Part 8. Yeah, 8 episodes into our Color Line sub-series already. That is crazy. Now, in this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about what fighting for equality looked like in the church. In the last episode, in Part 7, I talked about how the Black Adventist community was divided by these two strategies. One strategy was, we're going to fight for equality. We need to fight against the color line. We need to get rid of separate but equal and demand equality right now. And the other side said, hey, look, you're going to be charging the enemy lines. You're going to get shot down. And then what? I mean, what's the point of that? Let's just cooperate as best we can with the color line. And that's how we're going to get ahead. And of course, there were some Black Adventists who got ahead by cooperating with the color line. So there was some tension there. And so in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about what fighting for equality looked like in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So some people got ahead by waiting for it. It's kind of like the Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton thing, where one was willing to wait for it, one was willing to fight for it. Except in this case, those who waited for it, some of them did get ahead. They got to occupy positions of greater influence and power. And those who fought, sometimes they got ahead too. So looking back, I'm not sure if there's a clear kind of historical, this is the thing you have to do in this situation, because, it seems like both sides did okay. But anyways, we're going to focus on the fighters, and that fight starts with Oakwood College. Now, you may recall, Oakwood was founded in 1896 at the start of a long season of college planting, not church planting, but college planting, that saw an Adventist college being founded almost every single year throughout the 1890s, from Southern Adventist University to Southwestern in 1892, to Heidelberg in South Africa in 1893, to Solusi in Zimbabwe in 1895, to Oakwood in 1896, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Now, the strategy back then was to plant these colleges regionally. You didn't want them to be too far away from home because people had to walk to school or ride a horse or maybe a train. And, people just didn't travel that far from college. I mean, coming back from, let's say, California to Maine or California to Michigan, for spring break or something, that's a long, expensive train ride. There's just no need to go out that far. So because people didn't travel that far to go to college, unlike today when the goal is like, I want to get as far away from my family as possible. I know you don't think that, and that wasn't your motivation, but for some people it is, right? And so now it makes very little sense. Not as much sense. Community colleges make sense, I guess. But anyways, the point is we put colleges everywhere. Adventists put colleges everywhere, so people would always have an Adventist college that's close. Okay, that's just what I'm trying to say. Goodness gracious, let's get on with it. Stop holding me up already. Oakwood is the exception to this, because Oakwood was not meant to be just another regional college. Oakwood was originally it was for those freed slaves and their children who lived in the South, because, they needed to learn how to read and all these other things. And so it was kind of like a missionary school in that sense for that particular group. It wasn't just one of many other regional colleges, because like I said, you had Southern, which was it is in southeastern Tennessee, and then you had Southwestern, which is in Texas. So you didn't need Oakwood if you just wanted another regional school. So it wasn't part of that model. It was a different model that Adventists were pioneering there. But anyways, the first students at Oakwood had it hard. They were following the industrial education championed by people like Booker T. Washington, Ellen White. And the students worked as bakers, as weavers, as blacksmiths, and farmers. And it was hard on the faculty, too, because Oakwood burned through 2 principals in its first 3 years. The General Conference president, G.A. Irwin, said he regretted that he couldn't report better progress at Oakwood. The black folk in the South were just too poor to afford it, and the church was unwilling to subsidize, like every student who would go to Oakwood, to compensate for that. There was even talk that the school would have to be closed down around 1904. Oakwood, however, limped on as this hybrid training school. It provided basically a high school level education with an equal emphasis on practical skills training. But it wasn't until 1917, over 20 years later, that it was promoted to a junior college, which essentially allowed it to grant its students an associate's degree before they had to transfer somewhere else to complete their bachelor's or move on. Now, this was a big deal because so long as Oakwood was basically a very nice high school, it would only ever appeal to people who needed to, read and write and have a basic education, and who wanted to learn some skills so that they can compete in the job market. That wasn't a bad thing. That was a great thing. But if you wanted more, if you wanted to go to college as a Black Adventist, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? You're not going to go to Emmanuel Missionary College. You're not going to go to Andrews, what's Andrews today, or other places, right? So you needed Oakwood. Oakwood is what you had, or else you had to leave the Adventist system, which, of course, many did. They went to Howard and other colleges outside of the Adventist system because they had to. So it was a big deal that Oakwood became a junior college in 1917. And I guess, if you wanted to stay in the Adventist system, 2 years of college is better than no years of college. Now, this didn't mean you were going to get an associate's degree in chemistry, because most of the time when you went to Oakwood, you were training to become a pastor or a teacher. The problem, of course, was that Oakwood was still run by white people, so it took all of 1 year since becoming a college for one student, Elsie Graves, to announce a student strike. And 2 years after that one, all the students banded together for another strike after the school tried to expel one of the students. Student strikes were not unique to Oakwood in these days, but they were actually fairly common as growing student bodies felt they were unheard by these old school administrators. Now, it would be another decade, around 1931, when the students would finally be heard. When Arna Bontemps left the Harlem Renaissance and arrived on campus to teach, he noted, this is what he said, "This is perhaps the world's worst school. No buildings, few teachers, no vision, and no learning." Now, the students at Oakwood agreed, and they had several clear demands. First, why the heck are we still practicing segregation at chapel at a black school? White and black people were even banned from washing each other's feet during communion, which, kind of undermines the whole ceremony. Second, the academics at the school weren't very good. Third, the emphasis on developing, farming or mechanic skills interfered with the academics, because the idea had been that Oakwood would be a financially self-sufficient school in a way no other Adventist school was expected to be. And so students had to work these really long hours, and, after you work 6-8 hours doing some really hard work, and education felt a little secondary. Fourth, the students wanted the school to have black leadership. Fifth, of the black teachers they had, the few black teachers they had, the white teachers still earned more money because... Sixth, the students said that they felt prejudice from some of their white teachers. And seventh, they wanted more career options than becoming a pastor or a teacher. So with these demands in hand, the students organized, and they waited until October 8th when the college board was supposed to meet. At breakfast, the students' leader rang a bell, proclaimed that the students are now on strike. They wrote a letter to the General Conference president explaining their grievances. They wrote other letters to other influential people around Adventism. On campus, barriers were erected like they were revolutionaries on the streets of Paris 100 years earlier. The students made 30 more copies of their demands, sent them to pastors and others as well. And they wrote, in this letter, "We are tired of the lying. This school is going contrary to its purpose. It is driving young people away from God instead of driving them nearer to Him." In other words, they were tired of the unkept promises the church had made to black people. The General Conference was not, however, very amused. They did not like being dictated to by students, and they let Oakwood's president know it. Now, Frank Peterson, head of the church's Negro department, didn't like it either. Remember that Frank wanted to wait for change, to not rock the boat, to play the cards you're dealt. He told the students that you have done a very unwise thing and that heaven is not pleased with your acts. The school board at last agreed, however, to meet with the students and gave in to many of their demands. Now, the General Conference Committee decided that black leaders from the North should have a voice in how Oakwood was run. They should have a seat at the table, precisely what the students were asking for. And as for the college president, The General Conference at first chose Leon Cobb, another white professor who was at Pacific Union College, but he declined the presidency. Then they invited another white man who also declined the honor. And finally, reluctantly, the General Conference selected James Moran as the first black president of Oakwood. And for icing on the cake, 3 years later, the first black pastor of the Oakwood University Church came as well. Congratulations, it had taken 40 years for this to happen. Now, for good measure, 5 of the student ringleaders were also expelled for their part in the strike, because we can't have that. And Arna Bontemps, who was teaching at Oakwood at the time of the strike, knew the writing was on the wall for him. He would later write to a friend, "In race relations, Adventists are retarded." Now, that sounds a little bit funnier, a little bit stronger now than it did then. It just, meant that they haven't developed as far as those around them had. All right. Now, I'm telling you this story at length because it's not a well-known story. If you look up Oakwood University in the brand new Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, you won't find this story. The General Conference committee minutes don't mention it either. You would be forgiven if you looked up these records for getting the impression that the committee, just out of the wisdom of their heart, decided to make these changes with no pressure whatsoever. But of course, there was a ton, and they were largely giving in to what the students wanted. Now, if you were a particular kind of young Adventist back in these days, if you were looking at how the students managed to do what they did and taking notes, what would you conclude? Would you think, man, fighting for change, it can work, and perhaps it's the only way to get things done? Now, it wasn't the protest alone that produced change at Oakwood, but it was the unity of black Adventists from across America. And once you've got change that way once you've realized, hey, we need to stand up, we need to throw a wrench in the machine, and then we need to all band together. Once you've seen that succeed, why not try that again? So, while Lucy Byard, who we talked about in the last episode, while she lay dying in the Freedmen's Hospital in the autumn of 1943, a group of black Adventists met together to turn their outrage into action. They called themselves, this is really catchy, great branding here, the Committee for the Advancement of the Worldwide Work Among Colored Seventh-day Adventists. But we're just going to call them the committee. They constituted a who's who of black Adventism, included Alan A. Anderson, who 12 years earlier had been expelled from Oakwood for leading the student strike. The committee secured a promise from McElhaney, the General Conference president, to meet with him on Sunday, October 17th. Now, this was a big deal because, anytime you can get FaceTime with the General Conference president is a really, really big deal, and you don't want to waste that opportunity. And so Valerie Justice Vance, one of the committee members, who was called one of the brainiest black students produced by Howard University, took the lead. She worked all night before the meeting, making calls, writing letters, helping to shape exactly what this committee was going to ask McElhaney to do. Next day, the meeting with McElhaney seemed to go well, and so did another meeting that happened a couple of weeks later, and McElhaney announced at the Autumn Council of the General Conference Committee that these issues needed to be explored more thoroughly. And that meant the showdown, this final conversation, would take place just prior to the spring meeting of the General Conference Committee in 1944. And in preparation for that, black representatives were invited to the Stevens Hotel in Chicago for that spring meeting. Now, the Stevens Hotel, which is now called the Hilton Chicago, had been the largest hotel in the world with some 3,000 rooms. Every U.S. president has been to this hotel since it was built. It would also be the site of the famous Democratic National Convention in 1968 that brought thousands of protesters to Chicago. And I guess what I'm saying is this hotel has some serious history, and Adventists would make history there as well. The committee still felt they needed to hold McElhaney's feet to the fire. They had been promised things before, and they now insisted on monthly updates as to the agenda of this meeting, who would be permitted to attend, and so on. Now, McElhaney, for the most part, just politely brushed them off with the attitude that, guys, it's in the General Conference's hands now, and, we got this, so thanks and goodbye. The committee was, after all lay members of the denomination. They had no power One black doctor, Stark Cherry, he had a plan, however. He reasoned with McElhaney that it would be better to appoint some lay people to this meeting so they don't have to receive the information secondhand. Hint, hint, this could be controversial. The more witnesses you have, that's good, right? Yeah. So the committee showed up in Chicago with a pamphlet they called Shall the Four Freedoms Function Among Seventh-day Adventists? Now, this title was a nod to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, which he called for a freedom of speech, a freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And to FDR, these freedoms summarized the cause of the Allied nations against that of the Axis powers in World War II. And, I don't think the committee saw Adventist race relations as a war between, the freedom lovers and Nazis, but their Four Freedoms pamphlet didn't pull punches. They immediately made it clear, quoting Ellen White, that the church's racial policy brought the entire denomination into sin. What's more, they called the policy unchristlike for not allowing black people into Adventist schools and hospitals, and yes, of course, they cited the Lucy Byard case, among other cases. Now, the duty of white Adventists, this pamphlet read, was first to repair as far as in their power past injury done to the colored people. Second, to show exact and impartial justice to the Negro race. Third, to increase the force of colored workers. And fourth, to throw their influence against the customs and practices of the world, right? Don't be worldly, which is exactly what Jim Crowism was. It was worldliness. So, anyways, you're going to get me on a rant again. You're going to get me on a rant, and the church is like, don't go see movies, don't listen to jazz music, all that's worldly. But what was Jim Crow? What was Jim Crow? Come on, people. Anyways, let me fix my tie here. Point is, the committee, with all of these points, they put an Ellen White reference next to each of them. So argue with that. Ha! It also cited the names of places that would allow black professors or students without discrimination, in contrast to Adventist schools. Places like the City College of New York or Harvard or the University of Chicago, which was then employing 5 black professors. In a particularly stinging example, the document also named the Catholic University as a welcoming place for black students. Yeah, but not Adventist school? Yeah, I'm just going to tell you, if you don't know, if you're not Adventist or you're not really deep into the Adventist culture, especially back then, saying that the Catholics were doing something better than Adventists is like, those are fighting words, right? Anyways, I'm not going to get into why, but it is. That's provocative stuff. It also accuses the General Conference Committee of being disinterested in black Adventists. The Four Freedoms document goes on and on and on and on, carefully and concisely dismantling the church's racial policy. I mean, I say it goes on and on and on. It's like 4 pages, but you get the point. It's just a few pages. The one thing it did not do is call for black conferences. It still held out hope that conferences could be should be integrated, I should say. Now, McElhaney took the floor with 3 options for the delegates. First, we can maintain the status quo. Second, we could use the same plan we have in the South and just extend that everywhere because, Oakwood is working out so well. Or third, we could organize colored conferences. He asked, should we continue to operate on the status quo? Now, and he was pushing towards colored conferences because one of the black members present asked if this was something being forced on them. They had come hoping for integration. They didn't come looking for colored conferences, their own conferences. One black pastor said he liked the status quo if it meant being part of the same conference system. We don't want colored conferences, he said, and he made a motion to maintain the status quo. It was seconded, so now discussion can begin. The debate began over exactly what the status quo meant. Does status quo mean we just keep this mess the way that it is? We keep the Jim Crowism, the separate but equalism, or does status quo mean we keep the structure we have and maybe we can tweak that in providing greater equality, right? What exactly did McElhaney mean by status quo? Some black delegates there smelled a rat, particularly one pastor who said that some black people want colored conferences so they can have power, he said, and that some white church leaders want colored conferences so they can get rid of us, he said. But another black minister disagreed. Colored conferences would enable black Adventists to take greater control of their own destiny. And that seemed to be where a number of the white leaders were as well. William Spicy Spicer was in favor of colored conferences, as were other union and conference leaders whose support was crucial. Because as we've seen before, the General Conference can vote on something all they want. They can pass resolution after resolution, they can make promise after promise, but if local conferences and unions don't really support those, they can find ways to refuse to implement them, right? They can vote whatever statement they want, but it's up to the Washington Sanitarium, for instance, to accept a patient or reject a patient, or to set their own policies regarding white and black patients, all that kind of stuff, right? So they needed the support of these union and conference leaders. Now, this change of heart in so many veteran church administrators over the past decade must have been shocking. I mean, hadn't black leaders been told in 1930 to never bring this idea up again of colored conferences? And here they are. They're not bringing the idea up. In fact, white church leaders are bringing it up, and they're pushing for it. Now, at a crucial moment in the discussion, while this motion was still on the floor, McElhaney had returned to his room, apparently not feeling well. G.E. Peters, the color department leader, told the song leader to sing an extra song or two while he raced to McElhaney's room. The delegates in the rooftop ballroom were debating whether or not to uphold the status quo. That thing was still going on, and the meeting stood on the edge of a knife. If one person on either side said something insensitive, or if they couldn't all see a way forward, then every expectation of progress and hope that had been built up over the past 6 months in the wake of Lucy Byard's hospitalization would be lost. The consequences could be disastrous. The anger and despair in the black community would be fierce. Peters told McElhaney that if this thing falls apart, he will lose all credibility with black Adventism. Well, Peters wasn't exaggerating here. I mean, he felt the immense pressure from angry constituents to deliver for them and to deliver big. And so he told McElhaney, I'm going to lose credibility as well. McElhaney responded, if you feel that strongly, then ill as I am, I'll chair that meeting. So Peters and McElhaney rejoined the discussion, and in their own deft, skillful ways, they plowed forward. Peters dismantled the idea that some black conferences wanted colored conferences so that they could sit in the big chair. They just wanted power. McElhaney dismantled the idea that black people were incapable of running a conference. And slowly, the room came around to the idea that colored conferences might not be a bad thing. And it's not out of a sense of idealism, but out of a sense that we've been trying the status quo and it hasn't worked so well, so let's try this. I mean, there was also a fear that we could walk away from this with nothing. So colored conferences, it was. Now, when Spring Council met the next day, this discussion was 2 days before Spring Council. When they met the next day, a report lay before them from the previous meeting. It was recommended that colored conferences be set up and that the editor of Message magazine be black, that a school and sanitarium be planted in the North for black people, and so on. Well, not all of these votes bore fruit. No desegregation would be required of Washington Sanitarium or any other Adventist property. But at least black Adventists would have a greater degree of freedom and autonomy. They would be able to handle their own money and elect their own leaders. The recommendation as voted read that the 1930 plan of colored organization for the southern states be adopted for all territories in North America. I mean, who could have even expected this a year ago? Because of Lucy Byard, because of everyday black Adventists who organized together, because they were united, this got done. McElhaney thanked the delegates from the bottom of his heart. He says, I thank you for the privilege of talking to you, adding that he hoped these colored conferences would be established immediately and successfully. And it began to pay dividends because secular newspapers weren't printing as many stories about Adventist discrimination, at least not as many as they used to. And some of them even began praising the Adventist Church for empowering black people. But in some ways, the hard work was just beginning because black Adventists in Chicago had by no means been unified around this idea. And even though they warmed up to it, they now had to go and convince their brethren to warm up to it as well. In September 1944, the Lake Region Conference was formed. The Northeastern Conference followed next. And that left out Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. However, when Columbia Union officials said there wasn't enough financial incentive to form a regional conference there, well, the lay people rose up. They basically told church leaders, hey, look, we didn't ask for colored conferences. We asked for full and equal involvement in the church structure we have. But obviously, That's not going to happen. So all we have left are colored conferences, and you're dragging your feet on that too. Eventually, the Columbia Union relented, and other colored conferences followed. Now, I should clarify here in case it's not clear. These colored conferences, it didn't mean that you couldn't, as a white person or Hispanic person or an Asian person or whatever, it doesn't mean you couldn't join them. It doesn't mean it was only for black people. It's just that they were run by black people. And so I guess if you're a white dude and you join this conference, you're probably not going to ever become conference president, okay? So even today, with our regional conferences like Lake Region, which is where I'm at, there's Hispanic churches and other churches as a part of the Lake Region Conference as well. In fact, it's the biggest conference in our union. Anyway, so if any of the white majority in Adventism had managed to pierce the curtain of church politics and learned anything about this proposal for colored conferences, they knew it had been shut down. The idea had been shut down back in 1930. The word from on high, remember, was that this will never be brought up again, and yet here it is. You're just seeing it in black and white in your Review and Herald or whatever, stamped by the General Conference Committee. So, it just really must make you wonder, because the last thing you heard, the last rumor you heard was that this was a non-starter, it's never going to happen. Then one day you open your newspaper and you're like, oh, look, it happened. And it seems like it was the General Conference's idea. It's always the General Conference's idea. Anyways, Adventist editors explained it to their readers, often without much conviction. M.L. Rice opened for the Atlantic Union Gleaner with these words: "In the development of God's work in North America, it appears as if the time has come when a more complete organization should be perfected among our colored believers." Now, Rice then dutifully explained the Spring Council's vote and the next steps to be followed, but you can sense his uncertainty about it when he makes comments like, "The organizing of our colored churches into a conference will not be without its trials and difficulties, but if God is leading in this matter, then we should all courageously move forward. We are treading an unknown and untried path in this step we are about to take. None of us has gone this way before. It appears as if the time has come. If God is leading in this matter, we are treading an unknown and untried path." Look, I don't remember people having these kind of doubts when the first conferences were organized in 1861. Now, the president of the Southern Union was more confident in approving of colored conferences. Probably made his life a little bit easier. Though he felt the need to remind his readers that black Adventists have stood most loyally by the organized work. There's that all-important word, my friends, loyalty. Now, a few months later, however, Rice had regained some confidence in this new direction. He reassured his members that the plan to organize our colored churches into a conference is not a studied plan to further separate our colored and white believers. Rather, it is a plan by which our colored churches may more effectively carry on missionary work among the people of their own race. The Review and other Adventist magazines read differently in the 20th century than they had in the first 6 decades of the church. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to find a grumpy James White debating his critics or a young Jones and Wagner sniping at the General Conference president in Signs of the Times. If you found an article by Ellen White in the Review in the middle 20th century, it was usually some reminder or encouragement to stay the course. You didn't find too many people, often recipients of the point of Ellen's pen, confessing their sins and repenting publicly in the Review these days. It was all so much more polished now. The tone in these publications was consistently and eerily triumphant. It was always up, up, up. Tithe and membership numbers were always going up. God was always blessing. Every worker was described as effective and efficient. Where personal problems were hinted at, they were glossed over. I mean, one union president admitted that he had some challenges and sadly had to let a few workers go, but it was all with the approval of the pastors and churches in his field. I mean, you won't find many instances where a church leader publicly disagrees with another leader in the middle of the 20th century, in the Review and Signs of the Times and stuff. What this means is that a wall had been erected between leaders and members, because the earliest Adventists wrote like you were in the know. If James White was accused of embezzling or Ellen White was accused of faking her visions, then those things would be dealt with in the Review. And maybe you didn't know who was making those claims, but you probably could find out. You were generally informed about what was going on behind the scenes. After Ellen White's death, you would likely have no clue what was going on. which is why discovering all of these documents about the 1919 Bible Conference, for instance, was such a shock. The vast majority of members had no idea what the leaders in their day were really thinking. And that's why Washburn and Holmes wanted to expose it. They wanted to tear the wall down, but the wall held, and the experience of reading most articles in most Adventist magazines, then as now, was like staring at a plastic smiling face. It just made you feel good. The church is growing, our missionaries are conquering, problems are being overcome, Jesus is coming soon. Yay! A surface reading of all these articles would likely give the impression that things were fine between black and white Adventists. These articles celebrated black colporteurs alongside white colporteurs, people who went out and sold books door to door. You'd have to read very carefully between the lines to even get a glimpse at what these leaders might be thinking or feeling. When one leader says that the colored believers in the South have stood most loyally behind the organized work, he's reassuring the white majority that everything is going to be okay, right? These are the good kind of black Adventists, not those kind who leave. And when another leader says that the success of colored conferences depends upon the cooperation of our colored brethren, he is telling black Adventists, you wanted this, so you'd better support it. And when a leader says that these conferences are not a studied plan to further separate our colored and white believers, he is addressing concerns Adventists may have had about unity. And notice he says a plan to further separate our white and colored brethren. It's an acknowledgement that there already is separation in the church. But honestly, there's no reason to think most Adventists even cared about what was happening in the halls of power. So was all of this that was accomplished at spring meeting of 1944, was that ideal? No. Did it solve all of the race problems in the church? Not at all. Did it work? Yes. Writing a few decades later, one of the committee members, Joseph T. Dodson, summed it up by saying that they had gone from segregation without power to segregation with power. And surely that counted for something. The history of black Adventism since that time has been that of fantastic numerical growth and capable management. The worst fears voiced by some white leaders in 1944 were proven to be untrue. They could handle their own affairs, and they could reach their own people very successfully. But even in this victory, this progress, there's a sense that the can was once again being kicked down the road. Segregation still existed in the church, and the words of Ellen White, written half a century ago by this point, still echoed, that this was the plan until the Lord shows us a better way. Black and white Adventists are still waiting for that day.